Well, thanks for being here. We're both really excited to share this information with you all because it's the work that you all are engaged in as well, for the most part. And you're going to hear a lot of information about educator preparation. You're going to hear a lot of information about clinical practice and what that looks like in educator preparation. You're going to hear a lot of information about a little bit of interaction with one of our codes that we identified in our data and our research. And so you'll see a little bit of information regarding that, and including our codes that we had for our data. So thank you for being here first and foremost. Learning targets for today, good teaching practice. By the time we're finished today, hopefully you have gained an understanding of the importance of clinical practice and partnerships in teacher preparation. And so we'll unpack that a little bit. The form that you all have in front of you should help with that a little bit, and we're going to come back to that form in just a little bit because it talks about standards, a new set of standards, one element of one of the standards, which is the work that you're going to see here. We're also going to talk a little bit about, you'll get an understanding of the unique research design and methodology of the study. Jen's going to take that and share that information with you. And then, like I mentioned, interaction with one of the qualitative themes and compare it to research findings. Okay, so that's kind of where we're headed for today. Right?
I'm going to jump in real quick because I do. One of the things I think we want to make sure happens is if you have a question or a comment, don't hesitate to interrupt us. We're not offended. In trying to explain what we did from a dissertation perspective, it's a little complex, so feel free to go, what? And you did what? Because we want to make sure that you walk away feeling like you understand really clearly what it is that we sort of embarked on. So don't hesitate to interrupt and say you guys are making no sense.
Two layers that we want to kind of give you a little bit of basis with our work. First one being this manuscript that we wrote as part of our dissertation work really centralizes around a new set of standards in teacher preparation, and particularly Standard 2. And so we're going to dig into just a little bit about accreditation and how standards have come about and why that has changed some thinking in teacher preparation programs about clinical practice and what that means. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about that just to kind of lay the foundation. And then Jen's going to dig into the design a little bit, even before we get into the information and data regarding our manuscript. So really, two accrediting bodies, NCATE and TEAC, joined forces. And they created a brand new set of standards, and the new accrediting body is CAPE, so the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation. And they have a set of 5 brand new standards that were rolled out in 2013. And one of those standards in particularly really drew our interest. And that's Standard 2, which is clinical practice. And if you take a look at the sheet that was handed out to you, I put some information in there about Standard 2 and what the language involves, or is involved with in regard to Standard 2. But it's really highlighted because never before has there been language in a standard that is asking educator preparation programs to ensure clinical practice. And so when we talk about clinical practice, we're talking about the training of educators in the context in which they're going to be working, so out in school sites, and the partnerships that are merged there in doing so, what's being taught, there's shared accountability, how is that working together. So clinical practice is really a big picture, but never before has that been in a standard before. Standard 2, particularly, which is clinical partnerships and practice, is divided into 3 sub-elements, and it's comprised of clinical experiences, clinical educators, and clinical partnerships. And we're talking about those components because through the work that Jen and I did, we highlighted clinical experiences and partnerships. Those were our 2 lanes of this standard throughout our dissertation work. And so this presentation, along with this article, really talks a lot about clinical practice and what that looks like according to stakeholders' perspectives at a national level. Okay? I'll go ahead and Yeah, so basically, one of the models of, that really highlights clinical practice is the professional development school model, which is exactly what we do here at CSU. And so that model is ingrained richly into obviously the school setting, which highlights the clinical practice element of Standard 2. And believe it or not, there are not all teacher preparation programs, educator preparation programs require that element. So the PDS system is really unique in the way it's structured.
And I guess also sort of creating the urgency and the interest around this topic is the fact that because in the past educator prep programs were getting accreditation through NK, getting accreditation through TIAC, not necessarily required to embed the clinical practice standard, there has been some real concern and urgency on, as you can imagine, teacher providers, teacher programs who maybe have not focused on that to start really digging in and thinking, how are we going to meet that standard? And what is the scale up from what we're doing now to what needs to happen? And sort of foundationally, with Derek and I representing two different sides of the partnership and coming from a well-established PDS program, we felt really just almost required to do this research and to kind of highlight what's happening here and what maybe are some gaps to hit that standard.
Definitely.
Sorry, did I like that?
No, you're fine. So why Standard 2 and kind of what we talked about. So the provider ensures that effective partnerships and high quality clinical practice are central to the preparation so that candidates develop the knowledge, skills, and professional dispositions necessary to demonstrate positive impact on all K-12 students' learning and development. So that's the language in terms of the why. Why is this standard so important, which is kind of what we were talking a little bit about. So the design. So that's a little bit of information about accreditation and why kind of we're at this junction of why clinical practice matters, why it's important in educator preparation programs, and why it's the new norm, because it is in a standard right now. So Jen's going to talk a little bit about our design.
Okay, and I guess I already have intimated or talked about maybe why it's such an urgent interest of Derek's and an interest of mine. I have been in public education since 1985, I'm proud to say, and I have always been involved, I think based on personal interest, in the preparation of teachers. And then working at Fort Collins High School, I at one point was the ED 450 site instructor for the CSU class that was housed at Fort Collins High School. And then when I became an administrator, I was no longer able to do both of those pieces, but I have always been the liaison for student-teacher placements, ED 450 placements, and any really kind of very much tied into partnerships from our school, from our district to CSU. So I have a lot of, my personal research interest is I have a lot of time committed to the concept too. Derek, the same way, Derek started out as a public educator in an elementary school, moved over here and began working, whether it was 340, 350, and then 450 in the whole PDS model. And so when the cohort, so when we were invited to participate in the first PhD cohort that began here at CSU, it was a small group of about 11 or 12 of us. It was actually probably the first time I met you, I think. Yeah. And as we worked together, we started to realize how closely our backgrounds aligned, and truthfully, how we represented both sides of the partnership. And had so much experience with the partnership that it just really made so much sense for us to start working and collaborating on this piece of research. Couple questions or a couple decisions we made as we jumped into what was the work we were going to do. One was the focus group methodology. We were really committed to doing focus groups the rationale behind that was all of the research that we had read around professional development schools, around clinical partnerships, around residence models of teacher preparation, was all from the theoretical research. Here's a model, we're going to, embed it, we are going to see what happens. But there had never ever been a study that actually talked to the people who do the work. And we felt that it was so important, especially moving into a new standard, and sort of these, and I'll be honest, the standards were imposed on the industry, right, on the and so to get voice around, do these standards even reflect the work that we do? Do these standards matter? Are these standards achievable? Do they actually even represent the entirety of what we do? We felt like the way to dig into that was to do focus groups. And if you could you flip this slide? And you can see we just felt like the focus group really allowed us to identify so many different perspectives on clinical partnerships. We were committed to finding to hearing from multiple perspectives. So our initial focus group, we had a local focus group, and then we were able to do a national focus group. Our local focus group, we intentionally selected teacher candidates, school-based teacher educators, and university-based teacher educators. So we really intentionally selected the people so that we had representation across all participants.
So when you say teacher candidates, was that exclusive to CSU and undergrad, graduate?
So the group that we actually initially did our focus group for was CSU, and there were a couple UNC, because they were basically the student teachers who were currently working in my building.
Yeah.
And so the CSU candidates could speak, and the reason why we chose the student teaching group is we wanted them to be able to speak to not only, we didn't want to go to just 340, because getting the range of experience from 340, 350, 450 student teaching, they were really in a position to reflect on the entire experience. And like I said, we did have a couple UNC. And then again, the student or the school-based teacher educators were teachers in, again, Fort Collins High School who had mentored either 450 students or student teachers. And then with regard to the university-based teacher educators, it was an invitation out to the
entire staff.
The entire staff.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we really did feel like we got this very broad perspective. At the national level, when we talk about that a little bit later, I think we'll show that. We also were so privileged to be able to interview people that represented universities across the country, organizations across the country that were associated with educator preparation. So again, we felt like we really had this incredible representation of people who really understood teacher prep. And that really was the rationale for why we did the focus group piece. And so, yes, so you can see that with our local groups, it was university-based teacher educators, school-based teacher educators, teacher candidates. The participants at the national level, we had dean, superintendents, professor, PK-12 represented, national organizations, spokespeople for national organizations represented. We basically asked the same questions to both the local group and the national group, which was, based on your context, what is a clinical partnership or experience? What are the benefits and what are the barriers? And then from that, we generated pages, as you can imagine, pages upon pages upon pages of transcripts that we coded, and we actually started with a priori codes. So we had all of this interview transcript. We then went into the standard, the CAPE standard, the language of the standard, and we said, okay, well, if what we're looking for is maybe an understanding or an alignment between what people are talking about and what the standard should be, we actually created codes from this, how the standard was written. So we were looking at codes, I mean, I'm sure I'm getting ahead of myself at this point.
No,
Is
you're
this-
fine.
Are we good? We were looking at codes like mutually beneficial, shared accountability, collaboration, development of knowledge, development of skills, and all of that language came out of the CAPE standard, and then we basically coded all of the transcripts to the language out of the standard. Through that process, we also had emerging codes that we incorporated as well. So that's what the local study allowed us to do. When we moved to the national study, we used all a priori codes. In other words, anything that we had identified and coded and written about at the local level, those became the themes or the codes that we used to analyze the national focus group data. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. It was a very much a multi-tiered experience. Yes.
Just from a process perspective, how did you decide upon that as to go from the local to the national and then from
Yeah.
the qualitative development? How did
It's an
you-
interesting
It
story.
is, yeah. So Jen and I sit on a national commission, it's called the Clinical Practice Commission, sanctioned through AACTE, so the American Association for Colleges of Teacher Education. And this organization that was sanctioned through AACTE we have been charged with, if you're familiar with the Blue Ribbon Panel Report that was launched back in 2010, that was the call
Came out
for
of NCAPE.
NCAPE, which was the call for clinical practice. This commission has been charged for writing a white paper that is going to operationalize clinical practice. And so we've been doing this work now for a couple of years, and it just so happened timing was of the essence, and we knew that we were going to be meeting with this group in Washington, D.C. over the summer, that we needed to put together kind of our next steps. And so we submitted for our IRB, and were approved that. And so when we went to that meeting in DC, that's when we were able to run the focus groups at the CPC for this national group. And so we have representation from California, from Florida, from Texas, to Virginia, to many, many states.
Yeah, yes, Connecticut, I mean.
So
it
from
goes on.
deans to
Yeah.
full professors to K-12 educators, and so
Superintendents of school districts.
a pretty wonderful opportunity, really.
Dissertation gods were.
The dissertation gods were with us.
Yes,
They were.
because we had originally thought about doing, analyzing, what were they even called? I can't remember. Briefs, yes, thank
Yes.
you, Carol. Briefs that teacher preparation organizations submitted to CAPE for approval, and that we found out that we couldn't actually access them anymore, and we were in just a little bit of a panic until our amazing advisors said, hey, how about this? So,
Well,
and in the long run, it's so much better, because we
It really
basically
is.
said, here's what we did at the local level, let's learn from that and just, and repeat it and see, I mean, when I think about it, are we gathering similar information? Does what we do here represent the national perspective? So there were so many great things that came out of it, but it was really serendipitous too.
So the difficult part is we wish we could share a lot of information because there is a lot of comparison,
Yeah.
solid comparison
Yeah.
data that we'd love to share with you.
Maybe that'll be in the next thing we do,
Right.
like our postdoctoral work.
That'd be great. So the manuscript
Can't
today
believe I
is.
said that out loud. Am I I'm being recorded.
And you have witnesses.
Yeah, right, exactly. So again,
Yes,
literally today is only the national perspective about the benefits of clinical practice according to key stakeholders. So maybe a different day we can share that information.
And so, again, just to kind of give you a framework of how we put all this together, we ultimately wrote 6 standalone chapters, if you will. 2 from the local perspective, 2 from the national perspective, a foundational sort of background,
Historical
historical perspective, and then an article that talked about our collaborative research process. We then divided the articles so that we would have 2 distinct dissertations, added intro and conclusion. And so what happened was then, so study 1, which is the local, was chapter 3 of Derek's dissertation and chapter 2 of mine. Study 2, which was the national context, was chapter 3 of my dissertation, chapter 4 of Derek's. And the one that we're going to look closely at today is the chapter 3.
Clear as mud? It's very complex.
You all didn't do enough work.
Right. We're just sitting around.
All right, so let's kind of dig in and kind of lean in a little bit to the work specifically to this manuscript. So really the purpose is to describe clinical partnerships and experiences from the perspective of those individuals that were part of the Clinical Practice Commission. We wanted to obviously see how they describe clinical practice and what they perceive as the benefits of clinical practice. So that was kind of our purpose that we set out to using those a priori codes used from previous research.
So generally, because you're all in educator preparation, none of these authors should be new authors to you. And so, from a very foundational perspective, these were really the seminal articles, the researchers that we drew the bulk of our lit review from. And the NCATE report really was foundational to putting clinical experience and partnerships in the limelight. But what it didn't do is it was a report, and it just stopped there. And so what we are hoping to do through the CPC, AACTE CPC, and also through our work is really truly operationalizing and creating a path, creating a rationale, number one, but creating a deeper understanding of what does it look like to have a clinical partnership, and how do you either start one or improve one, sustain one. And so, we drew a lot from the NCATE report that, preparing effective teachers for 21st century classrooms, the programs must be fully grounded in clinical practice. And the academic piece and the professional courses should surround the clinical practice, as opposed to the academic sits here and we go, oh yeah, we should do some clinical work, right? I mean, foundational should be the clinical piece.
Mm-hmm. We obviously use a lot of Darlene Hammond's work with professional development school models. Ball and Farzani talk a lot about high leverage practices. So what does that look like within the experience of a partnership and the experience of teacher candidates?
Good Lad, of
Good Lad
course,
is
with,
pretty foundational. So
Right.
a lot of rich literature that we were able to dig through to kind of create that foundation for our work. So we're going to involve all of you a little bit. We weren't sure exactly how many individuals we'd have for today, but we're going to take one of the themes that we utilized in our work and have you engage in some thinking. We're going to take the code, which was mutually beneficial, and we'd like you to think through the lens of 3 different stakeholders in an educator preparation program. You have teacher candidates, you have university-based teacher educators, so as most of you are, and you also have school-based teacher educators. And what we'd like to ask you all to do is to think through what are the mutual benefits between those 3 stakeholders in a teacher preparation, in an educator preparation program. What are the mutual benefits? How do teacher candidates benefit from this type of program? How do university-based teacher educators benefit from clinical practice, and likewise school-based teacher educators? So take some time, maybe group up in 3s, have some think time, and we'll come back and see what you have to say.
have to participate when you come to a presentation. So thanks.
We're
Thanks for
teachers.
joining. I know, we can't just stand up here and lecture.
We have answered that.
Oh,
Yeah,
awesome, all
Good deal.
right.
So,
Okay, go ahead.
Something that we would just wanted to point out as well, and you see it throughout the education profession, is there are so many synonymous terms for the same thing. And so through the Clinical Practice Commission work, that was one of our tasks, to create a common lexicon so that we can truly professionalize the education profession. It's lacking. It's all over the place in some regards. So,
We laughed, you know, if you're in medical school, there really probably is only one word for scalpel, as
Right.
there should be just one word for scalpel, right?
right.
But we, you know, it's funny, because we started gathering, what are all the words that we use for a school-based teacher educator?
And this
It's like,
isn't
well,
even
how
all
do you even have a common conversation, not even, you know, not even university to university, I think even within a school
Yeah,
of education, we're like,
absolutely.
well, what is a teacher candidate? Is that a student teacher? No, it's the ED 450. So we committed when we wrote our dissertations to be true to this lexicon. And we've finally gotten used to using it, but initially, it feels very awkward to say a university-based teacher educator or a school-based teacher educator.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
that's
go-
what we need, you're
It
right,
just goes to show you,
insurance.
right, I mean, look at all the different
Yeah.
possibilities, and we didn't even list them all here, and so, anyway, this is what we chose to use within our writing, and it's, we have lots of SBTEs and UBTEs all over in our writing, so. What did you all come up with, in terms of mutual benefits? Let's start with the school-based teacher educators. What did you come up with?
So we said that it bridges, you know, theory to practice
Mhm.
and seeing that come to life. And then we were wondering about, we talked some about how can we go beyond the limitations from here within Fort Collins and the school district here to get those experiences for like rural and socioeconomic
Yeah.
and demographics. And so like just those observations and experiences. A balance between the positive and negatives of education in general and what teaching is and isn't. Renewal from the university through research.
Absolutely.
Balance research with teacher education. Teachers improving their craft through reflection with student teachers. And so the student teachers see good practice. Students benefit instructionally, and then the teachers improve through research and their own practice. Taking the isolation away with dialogue from the student teacher and the practicing teachers, and then just diverse perspectives included.
Great,
Awesome.
thank
Our
you.
summary.
Awesome.
I came up with a lot.
Yeah. What about teacher candidates? What did you think about? What were some mutual benefits?
So we talked around kind of the experiences that teacher candidates have kind of at the classroom and the systems level, and then gaining experiences in that way. You know, at the classroom level, learning from and with students and learning from and with their mentor teacher, so getting to try out kind of that theory to practice idea, having their courses be taught in those schools, and then being able to, you know, kind of use what they're thinking about in those courses and come back into the classrooms and do it that way. But also thinking kind of systemically, understanding what it means to be a teacher in a school, you know, working with other teachers, working with parents, working with administrators, thinking nationally, all these different agendas that are on you, and thinking about that idea of, you know, shifting your identity from being a student who wants to be a teacher
That's
to
right.
now
Yeah.
sort of
Absolutely.
becoming a teacher.
Definitely. Good.
Thank you.
Good.
Just the fact that it allows for several hours in the classroom, so they can get really adjusted and really they get comfortable with students and the environment, just the entire environment. But the downside can be that if they are paired up with a teacher in all of those different hours and they don't have a really solid teacher, that, you know, that doesn't give the opportunity for them to have a true growth experience.
True. There's a great example of one of the intricate pieces of a clinical practice, and how do we help train, you know, our mentor teachers to be mentors. They may be great classroom teachers, but can they mentor a teacher candidate? You know, so there's two very different skill sets, and so there's a lot that goes into that whole process. Yeah.
we kept coming back to that too, as we were doing our research, because we were really we focused on experiences and partnerships. The clinical educator piece that is in the standard, we really didn't touch. But what was interesting is that was consistently identified in focus groups as not a barrier, but a challenge, because we expect so much of our school-based teacher educators with minimal preparation to be a mentor, and minimal benefit from even a time investment standpoint. I think we give them $100 and say thanks.
And sometimes nothing at all
And sometimes nothing at all.
for some of our courses.
Yep.
Yeah.
So when we think about what we are asking these people to do for our profession, it is a challenge.
On top of it already demanding.
Mhm.
Right,
Right,
Yep.
yeah.
yeah.
Well, one thing we were talking about too is just trying to clarify, what are the boundaries around what defines clinical practice? So like, if you're having all the courses in a school, but you're not really integrating those courses into the school day in any way,
Right.
Is that count as clinical practice? And so we were just sort of trying to grapple with that, which I imagine your participants did as well.
Right. The idea that you can say you have clinical practice, but do you? And what's the quality of the clinical practice that the students or the experiences that they're getting?
And the clinical partnerships end of that standard is the nice thing, because that really, and we're gonna get there with our codes, but really, it's all involved. Everybody has to have a say, they all have to be at the table, so the experiences, what's being taught, what's going on in the classroom, those things, everybody has a voice in how that is ran in a true clinical practice, which is forged out of those partnerships. How about university-based teacher educators? What did you come up with?
So what we talked about is that it helps us stay current. But then that also has to be balanced with making sure that we're effectively preparing educators based on research and not following a fad. And how do we manage that, especially within our context of being connected with different school districts and partnerships? And so how do we support teacher preparation and balance that with, oh, look at this, oh, that looks really cool,
Yeah.
oh, that looks really interesting.
Right.
So, and then it's an authentic preparation, more authentic for our teacher candidates to experience is the perception that we have, because they're practicing in a context in which they will be employed, we hope. And then I really appreciated Ryan, his connection of, I get to stay skilled in my craft.
Yeah.
And so I still get to interact with kids, so I get to do that, but now I also know the theory behind the practice, and I can go in and see that in action and work with teacher candidates as well as classroom teachers. It's a great perspective of both worlds, and just helps us to stay grounded. Anything to add? Okay.
Thank you. It's great. That's really wonderful.
So we're gonna dig into kind of our findings, and Cheryl, and hopefully you can kind of hold on to what your thoughts were and maybe compare to what you see up here. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And go.
All right, so in this focus group, we ran 3 different focus groups. One of them actually was after the fact, after our meeting, because we had a group that wanted to participate, and so we ran that through a phone conference. So it was a phone conference focus group. In the first group, we had 10 participants. In the second, we had 7, and then during the phone conference, we had 4. So there were 3 focus groups. We asked the same set of questions. How do key stakeholders and EPPs describe their understanding of and benefits related to clinical partnerships and experiences? And then how do stakeholders' descriptions align with CAPE Standard 2, clinical partnerships and practice in current literature? So that's kind of what we were looking for, using already built codes going into this analysis. Snapshot of, oh, that's your slide, go ahead.
Snapshot of who who were the different participants, just so you have a sense. We've talked about this a little bit already. You see, it's quite a nice range of people and perspectives.
So we went into this study with 12 already identified codes. And 11 of those codes were referenced by at least one focus group throughout the study. We chose to only use 8 of those codes because those 8 were referenced by every single focus group, and that's what we decided to write about. And so the 8 that were utilized and that were spoke to in regard to the 3 focus groups are the ones that are highlighted up there. The ones that we did not analyze are listed in the bottom: performance-based assessment, diversity of experience, and professional dispositions.
And
So
I think
those
the
were-
disclaimer of that is, we don't think that it's because it wasn't important, but as you know, if you've done a focus group, they sort of take on a life of their own, and oftentimes they self-generate and self-perpetuate, and you may not, had we actually controlled it more and said, hey, but what do you think about performance-based assessment? We may have been able to have more data around that, but we also didn't really want to control it that way. We wanted it to be really organically driven. And so, I think we even mentioned in our work, this is not a reflection on whether or not those particular codes or themes are important in teacher preparation. It just was not something that was mentioned, and so
Did it surprise you?
the
No.
professional dispositions
Yeah.
won't surprise me a little
Yeah.
bit, but I will say, because this was the national group, so this is much more of the university-based teacher educators, which we see that at a kind of like a 10,000 foot level, the whole idea of teacher preparation. Where we saw a lot more codes around diversity, experience, performance-based, professional dispositions, that actually came more out of the local and more out of the teachers and the teacher candidates. So in that regard, it doesn't surprise me.
No.
Yeah. So the code of the 8 that received the most what's the word I'm looking for?
References.
Hits.
Yeah.
Is 26. We have mutually beneficial with 26 references. And that's why we thought it'd be kind of fun for you guys to unpack it too. And basically, the other piece when we put these articles together was, so much of it was, what did people say? So for all of our themes, we included quotes from the data, and I think the quotes are so powerful that we actually included one of them for each of the, more than one, but at least on our slides we included one. I kind of want to read it too, if you don't mind. Universities and school are constructed in such a way that they complement each other really well in terms of what functions they perform, that when put together, they can serve each other's purposes really well to accomplish increased student learning and teacher candidate learning. And I think in a nutshell, that's what we all said today when we broke it down. So.
And really, if your stakeholders are unable to identify the mutual benefits, then it's not a partnership in the first place. And so that was a piece that we talked a lot about in clinical practice, about how does a relationship that you may have in teacher preparation turn into a true partnership, and the difference between that transition.
So, Derek, I'm going to suggest, for sake of time, that, it's supposed to be over in a minute, right? We obviously have the number of references for our other codes, but I guess I'd like to see if you have any questions about what we did. Right, so do you want to just go quickly?
Let's
through it?
show them the 8
Yeah.
here. Obviously, collaboration was big with 10 references.
Mhm.
Collaboration on a lot of different levels and ways, and how that is embedded within a clinical practice.
Positive impact, again, another code, another piece of the definition of a clinical partnership, so there needs to be positive impact on all stakeholders
And including the students, the K-12 students.
and
And
community.
that's a big piece in the standard, is that how can educator preparation programs show positive impact
Mhm.
to not just their students and the stakeholders, but also the K-12 students. And so that's also listed in there as well. So again, sustaining and generative, how can you create a partnership and experience that kind of upholds the test of time? So whether you have turnover or new directors, new whatever it may be, how can that partnership, new principals, new schools, how can the system that you have built within that partnership kind of stand that test of time?
Okay, shared accountability, Derek had talked about that. How do you set up systems that allow all stakeholders to have responsibility and accountability toward the partnership?
Everybody's at the table. Depth, breadth, and duration of your experience. So what does that look like, right? So how does everybody have a voice in what that looks like? What is being taught? What are the practices? It's a practice-based profession. So what are those practices that need to be implemented throughout a continuum that kind of unfolds out in the school setting?
And I love this quote, you would give a medical student a scalpel on the first day.
So it's back to that purposeful continuum of, like Danny had talked about, how do we get these students to move from that student lens to that teacher lens?
Knowledge and development of knowledge and skills, again, that whole idea of the continuum and intentionally scaffolding the learning for students.
And praxis, and I think every single group talked about that theory and practice and that intersection. That term is obviously praxis, and so that was talked about quite a bit with 17 references. So, major findings of the study, alignment and descriptions. I mean, we took obviously the language from some guiding principles, specifically from clinical practice and specifically standard 2 clinical practice and partnerships. And so obviously the stakeholders that we ran focus groups had identified the language that they're using definitely overlapped with what we were using in the study. And so it was nice to see that component.
I think the other piece we really talked about was the idea that taking the standard, which is just, it's an outline, it's a recipe, if you will, but layering in all of those different experiences and allowing the voice to be in there, it just amplifies the understanding of what a clinical practice is. Just, if you make a recipe and it says, well, you need to add this and this and this, but then you talk to your grandma, she said, well, really, when I do it and I add this, and it's not really a teaspoon and a half if you don't, right? So you can take a recipe, or you can, but adding to it with people's voices just makes it more meaningful and allows more people to access what the standard expects.
Definitely. So, just for sake of time, anybody have questions that we can help answer, that just maybe design or methodology or process or findings?
Mine is more personal. I just want to know, how does this influence your practice?
Yeah, I think greatly. Oh my goodness, right? I think this dissertation work, and I think the work on the Clinical Practice Commission has given both of us opportunities to really think deeply about what clinical practice looks like, what we're doing in our own program to really heighten what we do, so that we can be a national voice. If we're asked to be a part of this national commission, then we better be doing what we're talking about, right? And so I think it has increased just some deep conversations about what this can look and highlight the great work that we're already doing, which is great.
Right. Well, and I think too, how many opportunities that we have yet to sort of unearth. I think about what amazing work we could do around more in-school research, really involving doing more action research with teachers and university people, and I think there's so many opportunities that can come out of a really well-developed partnership. So,
big question for me is, in your lit review, are there any comparisons out there between university-based programs and school-based programs? I'm thinking of one course in particular, like EdSite, taught on many campuses in teacher ed, and here it's in the field. Do we know anything about
oh, that's a great.
assessments of those programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a larger level, I think what we looked into primarily is you know, what does a traditional educator preparation program look like? What does an alternative teacher preparation program look like? And kind of the differences and similarities between those. And what we found out is if you throw away those labels, it's not about whether it's alternative or traditional, it's about what's happening within. And so that example of that specific course, you know, I don't know if that came through in the literature as
Yeah.
much.
I was gonna
wouldn't
say, I don't think we ever saw sort of a
No,
course to
no.
course that would be really interesting. I don't think that we saw that in our.
More so
research.
practices, right?
Yes.
So like what
Mhm.
specific teacher practices can we build through a continuum until the time they get to their student teaching experience?
Mhm.
Less about specific courses, more about
Mhm.
teacher practices.
Right, and almost, I think also sort of the level of confidence, that sort of, you know, the dispositions on the part of the teacher candidates comparing to, you know, like a PDS program to a traditional student teaching, and looking at studies on how prepared did I feel, how, you know, because, you know, the other piece is really taking it to the value added of trying to look at student public school academic results and tie that the whole way back to the quality of student teaching,
Right.
which I know people are trying to do that, and I think it's an interesting endeavor. So we saw a lot of that piece of, can we compare or teacher preparation programs based on end product of PK-12 students? And it was always very all over the place, to be honest. There was no clear, because I mean, you think about that value-added piece anyway, how in the world do you account for the myriad of factors that happen between the time you student teach and you have your first class that you teach math to, so.
I just want to acknowledge how powerful it is to have not only a premier clinical practice model here in the CEP program and in the school system here, but then to have, you know, our two CEP leaders really working at the national level and having such a major influence on this work, and how important that is for our future students and our future teachers. So I want to thank you for your.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun.
It
Well,
has
and
been
just
fun.
networking in general, you know, you get to speak to so many different
Yeah.
individuals that are doing the same type of work, and just to hear their stories too. It's been a great, well, it's been great PD
Mhm.
for sure.
Just as an extension of this work, so as you talked about that NCAPE and TIAC combined to
Mhm.
form CAPE,
Mhm.
and CAPE is the only accrediting body in
Mhm.
town, correct? That there is a new accrediting group that is getting together to make a suggestion of creating a second accrediting option.
Mhm.
And so what will be interesting is if a clinical practice, I presume, will be in that, and it's being developed by leaders of educator preparation programs across the United States are coming together. And it's going to be the Association for Advancing Quality in Educator Preparation.
Interesting.
So it's very political and
Yeah.
all of that, and so, but.
So
but
is the, you know, the TIAC NK thing was just crazy political too,
Right.
yeah.
And so I guess, where would you like to see this work go?
Yeah. Well, I guess specifically to standard 2, I mean, it's moving. It's gonna be, well, with the white paper that we wrote is finished, it's been edited. They're gonna roll it out probably in January.
And national
And
press
so
release in
this is
DC.
gonna be a big deal. And so, because it's gonna truly operationalize what clinical practice looks like, more than
I
that.
can't imagine at this point an accrediting body
Right.
not placing clinical practice
Yeah.
as a central tenet of the accreditation. But,
think
I
that-
mean, but you know,
The hindrance is the expense that it takes to go through an accreditation process. And I
Yes.
think you have small institutions and teacher preparation programs that
right,
they can't do that. They can't,
yeah.
they can't cover the cost, and so I think there's that element in and of itself.
I'd be curious if any of this resonates with China, your experience.
Yeah.
At the moment, I'm on a kind of project, but it's kind of teacher preparation for the university's teachers, because that's quite special in China. Sometimes a student will never get a chance to teach, and then they get a PhD degree, and then they were hired by university, and they are going to teach university students.
Yeah.
So for those group of students, or not students, for those group of future professors in, in university, how they could be educated,
Yeah.
prepared for that. That's
Good point.
Well, that's
That's a good point.
really interesting. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.